Ladies and gentle frogs, academicians and officers from offices of acrid admissions, aestheticians and members of the pusillanimous public, we are gathered here in love on the august anniversary of 150 years of Alice's adventures in Wonderland to witness a marvel of technology, the magic lantern. Sort of. Anyway. And a feat of the occult and hermetic hermeneutics. Why a magic lantern show? I hear from the rabble. I hear it anyway. As an inventor and a master photographer, Lewis Carroll was very much concerned with technology, and he actually would perform magic lantern shows for his child friends. And I thought that if I produced a magic lantern show now, using some of the slides from back then, that we could possibly invoke his spirit. And so I would like to summon to the stage from the depths of Hades, where the shades shuffle restlessly in expectant gloom, with the collective will of all present living and departed souls in this hallowed hall, the soul of Charles Lutwidge Dodgson, otherwise known as Lewis Carroll, to ask him to embark in a manner most unbecoming a dean of the Church of England, on what he would never have done in the flesh, a brief and lurid history of Alice's adventures in Wonderland and its place in our world. Okay. He's coming. This is the time we have to just think collectively, and he's coming. You're not thinking hard enough. Oh, no, you're thinking a little harder now. Don't be afraid. His spirit is not usually aggressive. I think he's getting much closer now. Very close. Just a little bit more, a little bit. Nope. Nope. There he is. Okay. We got him. Thanks for coming. And now, lest you think that what follows in this magic lantern show has anything to do with me, I want to assure you that all the following words in this show, nay, sentences, synonymies, semantax, morphemes, phonemes, phrases, and fricative fracas to follow are, were, and always posthumously will have been a sharpened speech axe from none other than the good Reverend Dodgson. I, with my own words, nay, sentences, synonymies, semantax, morphemes, phonemes, phrases, and fricative fracas will return after the show. For now, adieu. July 4th, 1862. Duckworth and I made an expedition up the river to Godstow with the three littles. We had tea on the bank there and did not reach Christchurch again until 8:15, on which occasion I told them the fairy tale of Alice's adventures underground, which I undertook to write out for Alice, and which is now finished. It had been read and liked by so many children, and I have been so often asked to publish it that I have decided on doing so. I have tried my hand at drawing and come to the conclusion that the result would not be satisfactory at all. I first thought of the title, Alice's Adventures Underground, but that was pronounced too like a lesson book in which instruction about mines would be administered. The heroine spends an hour underground and meets various birds, beasts, etc., endowed with speech. No fairies. The whole thing is a dream. But that I don't want revealed until the end. I should be very glad if you could help me in fixing on a name for my fairy tale. I took Alice's golden hour, but that I gave up. Alice among the elves? Alice among the goblins? Alice's hour in Elfland? Alice's doings in Elfland? Probably going through the usual awkward stage of transition. Alice's doings in Wonderland. When I have recovered a little from the shock and have been to the seaside for a few months, I will call and arrange another. Dear Duckworth, will you dine with me in Hall on Thursday? And should you be disposed any day soon for a row on the river, for which I could procure some littles as companions? I can't hardly keep my temper sometimes. He meant no harm, poor man, but I was so provoked that I threw a book at his head, which I'm afraid hurt him a good deal. I should be glad to know what you think of my idea of putting it into French or German or both and trying for a continental sale. I am glad you like the knife, and I think it a pity you should not be allowed to use it till you are older. However, as you are older now, perhaps you have begun to use it by this time. If you were allowed to cut your finger with it once a week, just a little, till it began to bleed, and a good deep cut every birthday, I should think that would be enough, and it would last a long time so. This is indeed dreadful. Alice seems changed a good deal, and hardly for the better. You have no idea of the grief I am in. I make no remark. It is rather a horrid story. I have, however, a floating idea of writing a short sequel to Alice, and if it ever comes to anything, I intend to consult you at the very outset so as to have the thing properly managed from the beginning. Your loving friend, C.L. Dodgson. And I think I can feel him leaving the room for the moment. Or maybe he's just going to stand in the back. In some ways, I don't feel that I have to say much after that show. Lewis Carroll's own words in his posthumous Magic Lantern Phantasmagory go a long way to do tribute to the place of Alice 150 years later. The high and the low, the artistic and the schlock, the seminal and the seminal, the later imitations and additions, the industry of Wonderland early and late. We don't hesitate to call Alice books classics now, as did G.K. Chesterton on the 100th anniversary of Carroll's birth in 1932. In the New York Times, he bemoaned this status. Any educated Englishman will tell you with a certain gravity that Alice in Wonderland is a classic. Such is indeed the horrid truth. It is a classic, that is, people praise it who have never read it. He claims that this dubious honor leadens the novel with meaning. Alice's adventures in Wonderland has, quote, hardened into something cold and conscientious. It has stiffened into a standard work. He continues with an audible sneer. I have a dreadful fear that the works of Lewis Carroll are now a part of education. In some ways, Chesterton's observations are true. We need only look to every children's literature, to every Victorian literature program, all of which would be, without Alice, circumspect. Alice has found her way into linguistics, philosophy, psychology, physics, astronomy, verily unto an academic wonderland. And yet, something seems different about Alice's life as a classic compared to, say, War and Peace. I mean, did War and Peace ever get a biscuit tin? Are there video games for Jude the Obscure? I don't think so. Is there pornography for Camus' The Plague? I don't think so. Alice seems to have moved beyond the canon to the misty and muddy realm of myth, pop iconography, even one might say to gospel. My main goal today is to reflect on how and why Alice made it. Not just back then, but also today. Why she now lives in the cold climes of academia that Chesterton feared and Carroll scoffed at, but also in the hotter, damper, funkier, contemporary climes that Carroll would have politely walked out on and spent many a night self-flagellating over. I'll survey some of these historical critical suppositions and posit my own dubious reading. That is both old hat, think a bowler, and slightly newer hat, as in an old schoolish kind of way, propeller beanie thingy there, on why we value Alice so highly. One thing I'm sure of, though, is that there are many reasons why Alice should not be thriving outside of academia. We might start with the illustrations. Many modern editions of Alice keep the originals, those stiff, old-timey, emotionally flat depictions by popular punch artist John Tenniel. But do these capture the modern eye? Can they compete with the punch and gumption of modern illustration? Are they any different from, say, Charles Raymond Macaulay's illustration of Rollo in Emblemland? It's pretty good, actually, by John Kendrick Bangs. If we take a genre approach and agree with Jan Sosina that Alice is a literary fairy tale, even a great literary fairy tale, by all rights, it still should have died. There were many other critically acclaimed literary fairy tales of the day, some of which still survive in the classic sense that Chesterton dreaded. Jean Ingelow, Charles Kingsley, George MacDonald, Catherine Sinclair, and Charles Carroll. But which of these are read outside of the academy? Even within the classroom, most have fallen by the wayside. All dead, mostly gone, though critically acclaimed, arguably brilliant literary fairy tale. In Alice, there must be something beyond traditional genre, as Carroll himself claimed. Of course, at the time, he called the Alice books fairy tales, but there was no other term that came close to what he was doing, fantasy not being used as a classification for almost another 100 years. As we've heard him say in the Magic Lantern show, Carroll did admit there were no fairies in his fairy tale, that he was trying what he called, quote, a new line of fairy lore. This new line, I would argue, ended up being a new, or mostly new, genre, whose greatness lies not so much in what it means, but how it doesn't. A point I'll come back to in a little while. There are plenty of other reasons why Alice should not have been beatified. Anyone who has read the novels to children or tried to teach them can attest to their being outdated in ways that impede our understanding and enjoyment. The language is full of strange, archaic words like antipodes, or rather antipathies. But like bats and cats, it hardly matters, as it seems nobody in my classroom a couple weeks ago knew either of those words. There's the treacle well the Dormouse includes in the story, where the joke depends on our understanding that treacle is a kind of syrup. Martin Gardner's annotated Alice, while helping immensely in figuring out these references, only shows how seemingly necessary footnotes are. Footnotes which generally do not lead to fancy-free reading enjoyment, except perhaps in the hands of masters like Joseph T. Thomas, Jr., the master of footnotes. Gardner also gives us annotations on obscure elements of Victorian leisure life, like bathing machines, those monstrous amphibious vehicles that clogged British beaches, or pop forms of entertainment such as the drawing room ballads of the day, like Beautiful Star or Beautiful Soup, as the Mock Turtle sings it, or pantomime, a theatrical form that is rarely seen today. And then there are the in-jokes, the references that only fellow denizens of Oxford would have known. At the Mad Hatter's Tea Party, the Dormouse makes much nonsense in his story of Elsie, Lacey, and Tilly, whose names are, of course, in-jokes in themselves, representing the three little sisters, living in a treacle well. These days, we're lucky to know what a well is, luckier still to know what treacle is, and luckier still to know that in Oxford, there actually is a well called the Treacle Well, or just outside of Oxford, there's actually a real treacle well there. The list of ancient obscurities goes on, from antiquated pedagogy to the Victorian class system to an outdated sense of monarchy. Many points, admittedly, we might have a chance of understanding with a little historical knowledge. Then there are the elements that we have lost and we don't even know it. Twinkle, twinkle, little star or little bat seems very familiar to us, and the Mad Hatter sings it in the novel. But what you might not know is that the song that Lewis Carroll had in his mind was not the song that you have in your mind right now. It was a different song, probably. Considering all of this, it's a wonder why any child still rides these unwieldy Victorian dinosaurs. Despite these rather strong arguments, the Alice books have, of course, become classics, and critics since its publication have endeavored to explain why. I'll give only two examples here, but ones that represent the typical schools of criticism, those from the 19th century and then the schools that came after the 19th century. We might look first back to G.K. Chesterton as a kind of flowering of the Victorian kind of criticism of nonsense. He notes, first of all, that with Carroll, quote, in a rather special sense, there is nothing but nonsense in his nonsense. There is no sense in his nonsense. He was only playing the game of logic. As opposed to Rabelais in his Tales of Gargantua and Pantagruel, for instance, whose ultimate purpose is apparent no matter how circuitous and absurd the path, Carroll's work leads nowhere, to no meaning. This line of thought descends directly from Carroll himself, who stated that he meant only good fun and nothing more in the Alice books. In one instance, after giving a child's book to a child friend, Dodgson wrote to him, "The book is intended for you to look at the outside and then put it away in the bookcase. The inside is not meant to be read. The book has got a moral, so I need hardly say it is not by Lewis Carroll." Edward Lear, the other Victorian master of nonsense, made similar statements. Further fueling this type of criticism, he wrote in his preface to his 1872 volume of Nonsense, "Many absurd reports have crept into circulation that the whole body of limericks have a symbolical meaning, etc. In no portion of these nonsense drawings have I ever allowed any caricature of private or public persons to appear, and throughout, more care than might be supposed has been given to make the subjects incapable of misinterpretation. Nonsense, pure and absolute, having been my aim throughout." Most of the critics from that time were convinced by such open declarations and saw the power and uniqueness of Lear and Carroll in this sense of so-called pure nonsense. They were tired of the evangelical and utilitarian varieties of children's literature that dominated the market and saw Carroll's Wonderland and Lear's Gromboolian Plain as blithely free from heavy-handed instruction. Such freedom from meaning, from the fire and brimstone of past children's literature, might very well have fueled Carroll's popularity at the time. But today, and to a great extent ever since Lear and Carroll, much children's literature is in this vein, taking away Alice's fire. And so we're no closer to understanding why it still lives quite as it does. Chesterton was a wily one, though, with one foot in the past but one foot far into the future. In 1932, when he wrote his anniversary essay, the industry of Carroll criticism was only getting started, and yet he saw the dangerous direction it was headed. He writes, "The soap bubble which poor old Dodgson blew from the pipe of poetry in a lucid interval of lunacy and sent floating into the sky has been robbed by educationalists of much of the lightness of the bubble and retained only the horrible healthiness of the soap." 20th century critics pop the nonsense bubble and use the soap to scrub away pesky paradox, finding healthful meanings, a wholesome glass bowl of grape nuts at sunrise. This is my favorite part. Should I stop it? It goes on for a while. I guess I should. This is Alice in Wonderland. They form, to some extent, what I've called the sense school of nonsense criticism, best summed up by Jan Sasina. Come on. There he is. While Wonderland may initially appear to be random, chaotic, and nightmarish, I think it is much more like a puzzle or riddle that must be carefully pieced together to discover its inherent pattern and meaning. Rather than an elaborate trifle, it is a puzzle, a riddle, unlike the Mad Hatter's about the raven and the writing desk. This one has a significant answer. Instead of cataloging the so-called answers grasped at, such as the infamous Alice the Phallus type of reading, all too familiar to most, I'll light upon Sasina as a scholar whose prescriptive reading, while still in the sense school, is nonetheless a bit more cool-headed. He argues that Wonderland was, and arguably still is, so popular with the middle and upper class audience because it supports, rather than challenges, many of the values of Victorian society in a charming and entertaining manner. It is the middle class represented by Alice and her manners of the drawing room that triumph over the apparent formlessness of Wonderland. Carol's emphasis on the importance of lessons and rules and the need to adjust to society made the text popular with parents who gave it to their children. Alas, Wonderland has moved from the playground to the schoolroom in Sasina's reading, where there is much to learn. There is so much, in fact, that we get Martin Gardner's 1960 annotated Alice, an edition meant exclusively for adults. The Alice books have such complex lessons that adults are the true audience, scientists and mathematicians in particular, explains Gardner. Children will be, quote, bewildered and sometimes frightened by the nightmarish atmosphere of Alice's dreams. We have come a long way from the anarchic, fancy-free readings of the 19th century to Chesterton's worst nightmare. Wonderland is a classic now because it has become a bourgeois lesson book or instruction manual. To recap, then, the value of Alice as a classic is a jumble of strange, clever, and often contradictory readings I've only just skimmed. Its utter senselessness, a release from seriousness, or it is a riddle to be solved whose solution involves our naughty, dangly bits, advanced math and physics, or bourgeois propaganda. My point here is not to disprove, as I could, any of these so-called meanings. Rather, I want to step back a little to recognize the hidden force generating this formalistic flatus. Since so few texts have generated so many interpretations, so widely disparate, so worn a mythic trail into so many aspects of society, it stands to reason that there is something in this sheer overabundance. And so, I hereby offer the ultimate solution. The grand answer you've patiently been waiting for. The generative force, but I love it, it's great. The generative force behind the multiplicity of meetings, Alice in Wonderland, is nonsense. Okay, this might be a little bit of a letdown for many of you. Sorry about that. After all, and here I might venture an absolute. All studies of Western nonsense literature base their theory of genre on two authors, Edward Lear and Lewis Carroll. And this idea isn't new. It sprang fully formed from the critical pen of Edward Strachey back in 1888, who elevated nonsense with a capital N to a fine art with a capital A and a capital F, reversed. And so, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, in a way, is the definition of literary nonsense. But if all critics agree on this, we might ask what exactly they're agreeing on, since, as we've seen, they disagree on just about everything else. If the value of nonsense is in it simply meaning nothing, then, as the Red King says, that saves a world of trouble, you know, as we needn't try to find any. Of course, the Red King reconsiders. And yet, I don't know, I seem to see some meaning in them after all. If the value of nonsense lies in its interpretation, then, like the Red King with his clever and completely ridiculous interpretation that follows, we are hopelessly lost. Their agreement, if there is any, must then be based on something anterior to interpretations, to the actual process of nonsense. In both of these approaches, it's assumed that value comes from interpretation, from meaning, or the inconsequential lack thereof. But value can come from elsewhere. It can come from process that underlies both interpretive paths. Stephen Booth, a modern nonsense critic, whose approach will be helpful here, begins by dispelling, quote, the assumption that analysis and literature, the assumption that analysis of literature and interpretation of it are always and necessarily synonymous. Not only can we talk about how texts function anterior to or isolated from their meaning, but, Booth asserts, this approach is exactly that which can explain value in art. Not that there's anything wrong with meaning, but greatness may not depend on it as much as we imagine. To find what truly matters to us on this goodly plain, I offer you a nonsense catechism to help explain Stephen Booth's contention. And for my catechism, I need a naive child to begin. Joseph? Stand, child. Erect. You look like a peasant.
What does the human mind want most?
To understand what it doesn't understand.
Once the mind understands what it wanted to understand, does it have what it wants?
No. It now has an understanding of something it understands.
Was that not the goal?
No. What it wanted was to understand what it did not understand.
How then can this goal ever be reached? Or must we always be wanting the thing we want most?
Nonsense achieves the impossible, dear boy. It gives us understanding of something that remains something we do not understand.
But what if the want I want is not wanted?
Sit down. Wanton child, your hair wants cutting. In his study of nonsense, Booth argues that the Gettysburg Address, Twelfth Night, and Ben Jonson's epitaphs are considered great works in proportion to how they give us understanding of what can't be understood. He writes, quote, perhaps the great source of the special appeal of highly valued works is that they are in one way or another nonsensical. Booth takes nonsense theory outside of what we normally would call nonsense literature, but I'm going to inject it back in to Alice's Adventures in Wonderland to show that the layered process of nonsense, surpassing most other nonsense texts then and now, is indeed what makes it live. By its very nature, nonsense literature achieves what Booth refers to, and it does this on multiple levels. I don't want to get into all the definitions of literary nonsense right now, but one of the more important elements for our purposes here is what Wim Tychus would call sense implication. Nonsense writers create most of the conditions necessary for us to recognize sense, but of course orchestrate some flaw around which the whole construction tumbles. Let's take a sample from Looking Glass. There we go. Perhaps the most famous nonsense poem in the world, Jabberwocky. We might look to one of the simpler devices, a so-called portmanteau word, such as slithy. 'Twas brillig in the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wave, while mimsy were the borogroves and the monaths outgrave. When nonsense really hums, It makes us run to the dictionary to discover the meaning of words we obviously should have known, only to find them not words at all. But we sought the dictionary for slithy for good reasons. First, the word simply looks like an English word. It is easily pronounceable, short enough, and appears to function as an adjective in a perfectly grammatical sentence, which we know by its ly ending and also its syntactical position between the and toves. These toves are things, apparently, and moreover, slithy things. The context outside of the sentence is also helpful. The rest of the poem, while having some nonsense words, nonetheless tells a fairly clear narrative. Further context is given in the illustrations. Add to this the semantic association, the implications that two words may have been spliced together here, a method confirmed by Humpty Dumpty later in Looking Glass, specifically the words lithe and slimy. Though I would argue that you don't need Humpty Dumpty to know the theory of a portmanteau. If we accept the meanings of the two words, whatever two words we come up with, combined, overall, we're still dealing with notions that lead to sense. And so, one might be tempted to pass over this word as if it made sense, to give us the impression that we actually know what it means without actually knowing what it means. To give it that obscurantist touch, Booth writes of the process, quotes, ideationally, this is of the process, ideationally insignificant coherence often takes the place of, does the job of, the ordinary substantive syntax-born coherence that we expect, demand, and do not notice is absent. That is, hearkening back to our catechism, Joseph.
We understand what we don't understand.
Very good. Be seated. This process has the most value, according to Booth, when we don't notice it. But in this case, we probably do. The whole thing comes tumbling down when we notice at least one of two things. First, and most important, slithy is not a word. Okay? Give it as much syntactic, morphographic, phonotactic, phonetic coherence as you like. It simply is not a word, and so any meanings we can glean will forever be conjecture. Second, whether we take Humpty Dumpty's argument into account or not, we realize, hopefully, that the method is flawed. Portmanteau might do well for coinage, but it is problematic when it comes to interpretation. How can we ever know which two meanings are packed up into one word? Slithy. He gives us lithe and slimy, but there's also maybe sly, or the, or slight, or ivy, or lots of things. It could be all kinds of things. If the nonsense process had ended here in Jabberwocky, we wouldn't still be talking about Alice. Countless poems have been written before and after Jabberwocky that use all of these techniques to tickle our sense of sense. And when Jabberwocky gets anthologized, and it always gets anthologized, as the quintessential nonsense poem, it is usually printed without any other Alice text or illustration. At this point, it's a given. 9 out of 10 scholars and editors agree that this is the nonsense poem, right? But I would like to add a little bit of heresy to my talk here. I want to say that Jabberwocky, as a standalone poem, is mediocre nonsense. There, I said it. Right? Alone, it would never have become a classic, never mythic, never swooned and mooned over. This is because its brilliance lies to a great extent outside of it, in how the poem is processed, both within and without the novel. And here is Booth's concept of greatness, in the visible, but especially in the visible workings of process. The interpretive process for slithy begins with the stanza of Anglo-Saxon poetry, the parodic poem that Carroll wrote in 1855 for the Dodgson Family Journal Mishmash. Here, slithy, with a Y, with two Y's, is, he writes, quote, compounded of slimy and lithe. But Carroll gives the overall definition here as smooth and active. A leap in logic and semantics, to say the least. This definition, however, is one mostly for the scholars who have access to such obscure Carrolliana. The next interpretation comes from Alice herself, of course, just after she has read the poem, where she states, "It seems very pretty, but it's rather hard to understand." While she doesn't give us a lot of information, she does provide this hint as to meaning, even relating to potentially pretty words such as slithy. The most comprehensive treatment, of course, of the interpretation is perpetrated by Humpty Dumpty. It's astonishing how readers tend to fall for Humpty Dumpty. His answers do have a kind of bull-headed logic to them that assaults us. Brillig relates to broiling, which seems fair enough, and he gives the reasonable explanation of the portmanteau slithy as we have seen. But when he gets to Toves, things start to go haywire. Toves, he claims, are something like badgers, they're something like lizards, and they're something like corkscrews. Even this absurdity is tempered by the illustration, which does indeed show a badger, lizard, corkscrew creature, lest our imaginations can't cope. And while the nonsense always has this back and forth pull, it should become clear that rather than a world-famous linguist, this is an egg. Humpty Dumpty is an egg. He wears a cravat. Okay, you should not trust him as an expert linguist. I don't know why we do. He's completely insane. He's an egg. Okay. Thank you. I had to get that out. Sorry. Those of us, especially in the academy, should know better than to trust any colleague who claims, as does Humpty Dumpty, I can explain all the poems that ever were invented and a good many that haven't been invented yet. As if this weren't enough meta-process, we have another instance in the preface of Carroll's long nonsense narrative, The Hunting of the Snark. After indignantly denying the suggestion that he could be writing nonsense, he instructs the reader on how to pronounce some of the nonsense words from Jabberwocky, adding more potential interpretations to the possibilities. He writes, for instance, that slithy is pronounced with a long I as in writhe, and so we add words like writhe to our list of possible meanings. Also in The Hunting of the Snark, he uses several of the words from Jabberwocky, like uffish and outgrabe, which gives these words even more bulk, even more suggestion of reality, when in fact they are not. Beyond the inherent sense manipulations of nonsense and even the idea of standalone text, Jabberwocky invites interpretation from many sources, including, of course, the readers, but also the young Carroll, Alice, Humpty Dumpty, and the older Carroll, and probably Joseph too. In this overwhelming multiplicity of interpretation, nonsense functions more in the process than in the silly meanings evoked. This is where we begin to touch upon the greatness in art that Booth is talking about. If we put all of these interpretive processes together, we might just get there, to that Zen-like state of understanding what we can't understand. With such overwhelming evidence for meaning, surely the reader is satisfied with the interpretive process, with a kind of assumed meaning, even if the meaning cannot satisfy. And yet, any doubter of greatness, if that is at all possible, might say that we are simply led to see the whole game as showing how fraught the process of interpretation is. Because great nonsense bounces our critical eye back and forth, our noticing the nonsense can actually get in the way of what Booth calls the truly revolutionary hidden mechanics of nonsense logic. For this, we need to look at the moments that are nonsensical in such a deadly way that we never see them coming. Indulge me for one moment here as I go to Jean Deleuze to elucidate, possibly, the process. Deleuze argues that Lewis Carroll's privileged place in literature comes from his ability to account for the paradoxes of sense, illuminating that sense is actually a kind of nonsense. Deleuze explains, sense is always presupposed as soon as I begin to speak. In other words, I never state the sense of what I'm saying. But on the other hand, I can always take the sense of what I say as the object of another proposition, whose sense, in turn, I cannot state. I thus enter into the infinite regress of that which is presupposed. What we think of as sense is merely a proposition that must be taken as a given, but that, in reality, can't be. At a certain point, no matter how far we go back in analysis, we have to take some sense as a given, a kind of sense that can't be articulated because as soon as it is, a prior sense is implied to prove the current one. And so to proceed thinking, sense is to be blind to its true nonsensicality. As Deleuze states, there is no true end to this, and true sense is always just beyond our grasp. According to Deleuze, what we call sense is a necessary blindness to nonsense. And what Booth calls the best, most pleasurable kind of nonsense is similar in its complicity in impersonating sense. The point is that there is no understanding as the child wants it in the catechism. There is no endpoint. What we want, again, is not to understand what we understand, but to understand what we don't. The only way this is possible is through the embracing of truth as paradox, which just so happens to be the specialty of nonsense literature and its tendency towards sense implication. And truth as paradox arises only in nonsense literature through a continual analytical process that gets us nowhere. One of the most accomplished examples of this in literature is, of course, Alice's adventures in Wonderland. Heady stuff. So let's turn to a few final examples. As we've seen, the greatness of Jabberwocky is not so much in its linguistic inventiveness as most would claim, but rather in the nature of analysis surrounding it, deepening our sense of sense implication. But there are some other more subtle ways that Carroll gives us the sense that we understand what we don't. For example, just after Alice reads Jabberwocky for the first time, the narrator says, quote, "She couldn't make it out at all," implying a complete blank, especially with the tag "at all." Yet, as she thinks about it, it becomes clear that the narrator must be wrong. She says to herself, quote, "Somebody killed something, that's clear at any rate." Well, either she doesn't get it at all, or she does get a part of it, and quite clearly. And because we can see that Alice is right, the narrative voice must be wrong, throwing its authority into doubt. And then there is the concept that arises from her saying, quote, "Somehow it seems to fill my head with ideas, only I don't know exactly what they are." This introduces a kind of ontological octopus who asks, is it possible to have an idea that you don't know? As he does. It seems that this knowing is a condition of having an idea. In other words, isn't consciousness of an idea a prerequisite for its existence? Well, the last hidden conundrum relates to the illustrations. When Alice first reads the poem, we are given the illustration of the battle between the Jabberwock and the boy. And so it seems that this illustration is, in a way, a part of the text of the poem, like a picture book. The concept stands until we get to Humpty Dumpty's analysis of the poem, which also has an accompanying illustration, but 50 pages or so after the poem appears in the book. Should we take the latter illustration as an authoritative second illustration of the poem, or is it an envisioning of Humpty Dumpty's brilliant, flawed interpretation, detached from or possibly contrary to the original piece? The sense of the illustration only is so until we question the authority, the nature of these illustrations. This leads to the nature of illustration itself, and we find ourselves in that infinite regression of that which is presupposed, the Deleuzian loop. These kinds of hidden nonsense moments appear frequently in the Alice books. In the beginning of Wonderland, when Alice listens to the mouse's tale, we get the classic linguistic mix-up of tale and tale. Booth mentions such puns as one of the weaker elements of nonsense because we get the game. The inversion is clear. These cannot exist simultaneously, but we see exactly why they can't, which, in a way, eliminates the tension between meanings so important to nonsense. But the stronger part of nonsense, as Booth suggests, is where it fools us. The sense implication that is so convincing that we ourselves believe it, at least until we can figure otherwise. To return to Alice's mix-up of tale and tale, we see how Alice envisions the tale, a tale-shaped concrete poem. And so her question, when she asks, you had got to the fifth bend, I think, makes sense in terms of the pun. But rather than replying to either sense of the word tail, the mouse angrily cries, "I had not." His response doesn't follow at all from Alice's question, from either of the meanings. What could a bend mean to the mouse at this point? His denial can't be explained, though it does provide the next pun, and our attention goes to the easy gag. But the most intriguing and satisfying nonsense here lies in what is much harder to see. The last example I'll give is with the Cheshire Cat, when Alice asks, would you tell me, please, which way I ought to go from here? That depends a good deal on where you want to get to, said the cat. I don't much care where, said Alice. And it doesn't matter which way you go, said the cat. So long as I get somewhere, Alice added as an explanation. Oh, you're sure to do that, said the cat, if only you walk long enough. Alice felt that this could not be denied, so she tried another question. The Cheshire Cat is a master of a common nonsense technique, that of stating the obvious. Of course, it doesn't matter which way one goes if the destination isn't important. But when Alice adds that she wants to get somewhere, we shift further into uncertainty. Does she mean somewhere fun or interesting or curious or simply not here, as the emphasis might suggest? The question itself doesn't make sense. And so it's no surprise that the cat's response only furthers the mystery. Walking, of course, gets us somewhere, but walking enough does this no better. The implication is that if you don't walk enough, you actually would not get somewhere, which is clearly not true. Somewhere is anywhere you go. And so, contrary to Alice's response, it seems that the narrator's last statement could indeed be denied, further diminishing the narrator's authority and trustworthiness. Alice, however, sees perfect sense in it. And even if we don't, we can get the vicarious pleasure that Booth mentions from seeing someone else who is blind to the nonsense. And so, we reach the end, proving something we already knew, to some extent, that Alice's Adventures in Wonderland lives and breathes 150 years later, not because it is inconsequential flibber-flabber, not because it is a secret code for lessons of various kinds, but because it is literary nonsense. It privileges process over product. And the richer and deeper the process, the more we can see that it is, in effect, the real product. It is a classic that has avoided the pitfalls Chesterton feared, despite the best efforts of the Academy. All the adaptations, editions, video games, music, the cultural iconography and pornography, these are all, in a way, valid interpretations. Everything makes sense to us because the sense we imagine is not, in a way, real. The results of individual acts of interpretation are mayflies. They live for a day. But the pristine nonsense process never ends. It ensures Alice's life for a long time to come. But wait. He's going to leave us now, I think. I think he has to go. Away, away. Thank you, Lewis Carroll. And thank you all. Thank you to Joseph and everyone else. Thank you so much.